I want to begin with something that Gabor Mate said quietly, almost to himself, at the end of a long conversation about what he had learned from 50 years of sitting with human beings in their most unguarded moments. He said, "The rarest thing I have ever encountered in a human being is not intelligence. It is not talent. It is not even kindness, though kindness matters enormously. The rarest thing I have ever encountered is a person who has chosen, consciously, deliberately, at real personal cost, to become themselves. Not a better version of someone else, not the person their parents needed them to be, not the person their culture rewarded or their wounds shaped or their fears permitted. Themselves, fully, without apology, without the performance, without the armor." He paused, and then he said, "I can count the number of people I have met who have truly done this on less than 2 hands. And every single one of them had something in common. Not a particular background, not a particular level of education or privilege or circumstance, something far more interior than any of those things. Something that lived in the specific quality of how they moved through the world, how they listened, how they suffered, how they loved, how they failed, and what they did with the failure. And I have been thinking about that observation ever since, because I believe Gabor Mate was pointing at something real, something that matters, something that most conversations about personality and character and self-development completely miss, because they are looking at the surface when the thing that actually distinguishes these rare human beings lives at a depth that most frameworks never reach. Today I want to go to that depth with you. I want to tell you about the 10 personality traits that Gabor Mate identified through decades of clinical work, through his own autobiography, through his research into the connections between human psychology and physical health, between early experience and adult character, as the markers of a person who has genuinely chosen the path of becoming themselves. These are not traits you are born with or without. They are not fixed. They are not genetic destiny. They are, every single one of them, the fruit of a specific kind of inner work. The kind of inner work that most people sense they need and very few people actually do. Not because they are lazy or weak or unwilling, but because no one showed them the door, because the culture we live in rewards the performance of wellness rather than the reality of it, because it is far easier and far more socially acceptable to remain in the comfortable numbness of an adapted life than to undertake the terrifying and magnificent work of becoming who you actually are. But some people find the door. Some people, for reasons that are different in every case, that involve a particular kind of suffering or a particular kind of encounter or a particular moment of seeing that cannot be unseen, some people begin the work. And the traits I am about to describe are what that work produces, what it grows, what it reveals, slowly and imperfectly and beautifully, in a human being who has chosen to stop managing their life and start living it. If you recognize yourself in these traits, fully or partially, as an aspiration or as an already lived reality, I want you to drop 777 in the comments the moment you feel that recognition. Because 777 in this space is not a number, it is a declaration. It is the signal of a nervous system that has begun to recognize itself. And the field that gathers in the comments of this video when those numbers appear is something I want you to be part of. You belong in it. The fact that you are here tells me you already know that. Type 777 when the recognition comes, and let us begin. The first trait, they have learned to live in their body rather than above it. Gabor Mate returns to this again and again, in every book, in every lecture, in every clinical encounter he has ever described. He says most people in our culture live from the neck up. They exist in the narration of their experience rather than in the experience itself. They are in the head, planning, analyzing, judging, explaining, constructing stories about what is happening, while the body, which is where all the real information lives, goes unattended, unfelt, unread. The rare person has learned, often through suffering, often through the specific suffering that comes when the body finally refuses to be ignored, to come home to the body, to feel the breath, to notice the tightening in the chest or the opening in the belly, to recognize that the body is not a vehicle for the mind, but the mind's most honest expression, that what the body feels in any given moment is a more accurate report on what is actually happening than any narrative the mind can construct. This does not happen automatically. It is a practice, a daily, moment-by-moment, imperfect and ongoing practice of returning to the felt sense of being alive, of asking not what do I think about this, but what do I feel about this, and then waiting for the answer that comes not from the mind but from somewhere below it, from the body, from the place where all the things that have ever happened to you are still living, still speaking, still waiting to be heard. The rare person has begun to listen. The second trait, they have stopped performing wellness and started practicing honesty. There is a particular exhaustion that Gabor Mate recognized in patient after patient, an exhaustion that had nothing to do with how much they had slept, or how many vitamins they were taking, or how optimized their morning routine was. It was the exhaustion of performance, of maintaining year after year, decade after decade, the image of a person who is fine, who is coping, who does not need too much, who is not too angry, not too sad, not too scared, not too much of any of the things that the world around them had taught them were not welcome. The rare person has put down that performance. Not all at once, it never happens all at once, but gradually, piece by piece, in the specific moments when the cost of the performance finally exceeded the cost of the honesty. They have learned to say, I am not fine when they are not fine, to say I need help when they need help, to say this is hard when it is hard, to allow the people in their lives to actually see them rather than the carefully managed version of themselves they once believed was the only version safe to show. Gabor Mate says this kind of honesty is not weakness. It is the beginning of genuine connection. Because you cannot truly connect with a performance. You can only connect with a person. And the rare person has become willing, at real personal cost through real personal fear, to be a person rather than a performance. The third trait, they have made peace with their own history. Not made peace in the sense of pretending it did not happen. Not made peace in the sense of minimizing or explaining away or deciding to be grateful for the trauma because it made them stronger. Gabor Mate is very clear about this. He does not believe in the spiritualization of suffering. He does not believe that what happened to you was meant to happen, or that everything happens for a reason, or that your wounds were gifts in disguise. He believes something far more honest and far more healing than any of those things. He believes that what happened to you was real, that it had real consequences, that it shaped you in ways you did not choose and could not control, and that the path to freedom is not through denial or reframing or gratitude, but through genuine seeing. Through allowing yourself to know what happened, to feel what it cost, to grieve what was lost or never available, and then, from that place of honest acknowledgement, not before it, to discover that the history does not have to be the future, that what happened to you is not who you are, that the person who was shaped by those experiences is not a finished product but an ongoing becoming. The rare person has done this work, imperfectly, incompletely, with setbacks and returns to old patterns and moments of profound doubt, but genuinely, they have turned toward their own history with honesty rather than away from it with defense. And in doing so, they have discovered something extraordinary, that the history they were most afraid to look at directly is far less powerful when seen clearly than it was when avoided. That the wound, when genuinely felt, begins to integrate, begins to become not the center of the story but one chapter in it. The fourth trait, they experience genuine empathy rather than performed compassion. Gabor Mate draws a distinction that most people have never considered. He says there is a fundamental difference between empathy, the genuine capacity to feel into another person's experience, to let their reality actually land in your body, to be moved by what moves them, and performed compassion, which is the expression of concern without the underlying felt connection. Performed compassion is extremely common. It is socially rewarded. It looks from the outside identical to genuine empathy. But inside the person performing it, there is a distance, a management, a careful regulation of how much of the other person's pain is allowed in, because the person performing compassion has not yet done enough of their own work to be able to tolerate genuine contact with another's suffering without it threatening their own carefully maintained equilibrium. The rare person has genuine empathy, not because they are more virtuous or more gifted than others, but because they have done enough of their own work, have sat with enough of their own pain, have allowed enough of their own vulnerability to be present, that they are no longer afraid of what they might feel if they truly let another person's experience in. They can be moved, they can be affected, they can sit with someone in their suffering without immediately trying to fix it or reframe it or make it more comfortable for themselves. This is the rarest quality in a helper and the most healing thing one human being can offer another. The fifth trait, they have learned to set boundaries from love rather than from fear. Gabor Mate says one of the most reliable indicators of early wounding is a person's relationship with boundaries. Because healthy boundaries, genuine, clear, respectful, self-honoring limits on what you are willing to accept in relationship, require a world in which your own experience matters, in which your own needs are real, in which you are permitted to say no without the immediate dread of abandonment or punishment or the withdrawal of love. Many people set no boundaries at all. They give until they are empty. They accept what is unacceptable. They make themselves available past the point of their own depletion, not because they want to, but because their early world taught them that this was what love required, that their own needs were secondary, that the price of connection was self-erasure. Other people set rigid, defensive, often hostile limits that are not really boundaries at all, but walls, built not from self-respect, but from the decision, made after too much hurt and too little healing, that the only safe position is behind a barrier that nothing can penetrate. The rare person has learned a third way, boundaries that come from genuine self-knowledge, that say this is who I am, and this is what I need, and this is what I am not able to accept, not with anger, not with apology, not with the need for the other person to understand or agree or validate the limit, simply with the quiet, grounded certainty of someone who knows themselves well enough to know what they can and cannot give without losing themselves in the giving. Gabor Mate calls this mature love, and he says it is extraordinarily rare precisely because it requires exactly the kind of inner work that most people have not yet done. The sixth trait, they are curious about themselves without being self-obsessed. There is a distinction that Gabor Mate made in a conversation I have returned to many times. He said, there is a difference between self-awareness and self-obsession. Self-obsession is actually a defense against self-awareness. It is the constant narration of the self, the endless analysis, the circular thinking, the preoccupation with how one is perceived, that creates the appearance of introspection while actually maintaining a very careful distance from genuine self-knowledge. Genuine self-awareness is quieter, more intermittent, less about constructing a coherent narrative about yourself and more about being genuinely curious about what is actually happening inside you, about noticing without immediately judging the reactions that arise, the feelings that appear unexpectedly, the patterns that repeat, the defenses that activate, and asking with genuine openness rather than the need for a particular answer, what is this telling me? What does this reveal about the world I am living in? What old wound is speaking through this present moment? The rare person has this quality of curious self-witness. They are interested in themselves the way a good scientist is interested in their subject, with rigor and without agenda. They can look at their own worst behavior with honesty rather than shame. They can acknowledge their patterns without using the acknowledgement as another form of self-punishment. They can be wrong about themselves and revise their self-understanding without experiencing the revision as a threat to their identity. This is one of the most difficult qualities to develop, because it requires the gatekeeper, the part of us that is deeply invested in the coherence of the story we tell about ourselves, to loosen its grip, to be willing to not know, to be willing to be surprised by what the genuine inquiry reveals. And that loosening is one of the bravest things a human being can do. The seventh trait, they have developed the capacity to grieve. Gabor Mate says this is perhaps the most undervalued psychological capacity available to a human being. Not just the ability to feel sad, the full embodied, genuinely felt movement of grief through the system, the capacity to mourn what was lost, what was never available, what was given and taken back, what was hoped for and did not come, what the wound cost, what the adaptation required. Most people in our culture are profoundly grief avoidant, not because they are cold or unfeeling, but because grief was not modeled for them. Because the culture they were raised in treated grief as something to be moved through as quickly as possible, to be managed, to be resolved into productivity or gratitude, or the silver lining narrative as fast as decency allows. Because their early worlds in many cases could not hold grief, and so they learned to hold it somewhere in the body instead, where it has been accumulating ever since. The rare person has learned to grieve, not as a performance of sadness, but as a genuine biological process, the process by which the nervous system completes what was interrupted, releases what was held, integrates what was too much to feel at the time. And on the other side of genuine grief, not the managed, quickly resolved, silver-lined version, but the real thing, the rare person has discovered something that Gabor Mate documented in patient after patient who had finally been willing to feel what they had been suppressing for decades. An extraordinary lightness, a quality of presence that was not available before, a sense of being genuinely alive in a way that the defended grief-avoidant life had never permitted. The eighth trait, they have stopped trying to fix other people. This one surprises people, because the impulse to fix, to help, to advise, to solve, to rescue feels like care. It presents itself as love. It is socially rewarded as generosity and competence and reliability, but Gabor Mate says something that cuts right through that appearance. He says, the compulsion to fix other people is almost always a way of avoiding your own experience. It keeps you focused outward, where the work feels more manageable, more clear, more within your control than the work of actually sitting with what is happening inside yourself. It also, and this is the part that is harder to hear, it does not actually help the person being fixed. Because what people need far more than solutions is to be genuinely seen, to have their experience met with presence rather than with strategy, to feel that the person with them is actually with them in the difficulty rather than working hard to make the difficulty go away as quickly as possible. The rare person has learned to be present rather than useful, has learned to ask what do you need rather than immediately offering what they would need in the same situation, has learned to tolerate the discomfort of sitting with another person's pain without rushing to resolve it. This is a profound act of maturity, and it comes directly from the work they have done with their own pain, from having learned in their own experience that presence is more healing than solutions. The ninth trait, they have made authenticity non-negotiable. Gabor Mate says the loss of authenticity is the beginning of almost every form of physical and psychological suffering he has documented. Because authenticity is not a value or a preference or a lifestyle choice, it is a biological need. The organism requires congruence between what it feels and what it expresses, between who it is and how it presents itself to the world. When that congruence is chronically violated, when the gap between the inner experience and the outer performance is maintained year after year, decade after decade, the body pays the price. The rare person has closed that gap. Not completely. No one closes it completely, and the aspiration to complete closure is itself a kind of perfectionism that creates its own suffering. But substantially, meaningfully, in the specific ways that matter most, they have stopped saying yes when they mean no. They have stopped performing emotions they do not feel. They have stopped presenting a version of themselves calibrated to produce a particular response in the people around them, and started, instead, simply being what they actually are, messy and contradictory and incomplete and genuine. And here's what Gabor Mate found happens when people do this. When they close the gap between the performance and the reality, the body begins to heal. The chronic symptoms that had no clear medical cause begin to resolve. The fatigue lifts, the immunity strengthens. The nervous system, no longer spending its energy maintaining the performance, is able to redirect that energy toward the regenerative processes it was always designed to run. Authenticity is not just psychologically healthy, it is biologically necessary. And the rare person has understood this not as an intellectual concept, but as a lived, embodied, felt truth. The 10th trait, and this is the one that Gabor Mate spoke of with the most reverence, the one he said he had spent the longest arriving at in his own life, the one he believed was the culmination and the container of all the others. They have learned to love without losing themselves, not the love that is really need dressed in generous clothing, not the love that gives in order to receive, not the love that makes itself indispensable in order to ensure it will not be abandoned. Not the love that disappears into the other person, that forgets its own shape, that confuses merger with intimacy and calls the resulting dependency connection. The love that the rare person has learned to give and to receive is something far more difficult and far more beautiful than any of those things. It is the love of two people who are genuinely themselves, who have done enough of their own work to know who they are, what they need, what they value, where their edges are, meeting each other in the full complexity of their separate selfhoods and choosing again and again to remain, not because they cannot leave, not because the fear of aloneness outweighs the difficulty of the relationship, but because the genuine meeting of two real selves is the most extraordinary experience available to a human being. And once you have tasted it, once you have experienced the profound difference between genuine intimacy and the performed closeness that most people spend their lives mistaking for it, nothing else will satisfy. Gabor Mate calls this mature love. And he says it is rare not because people do not want it, everyone wants it. It is rare because it requires everything I have described in the previous 9 traits: the embodied presence, the honesty, the made peace with history, the genuine empathy, the self-honoring boundaries, the curious self-witness, the capacity to grieve, the willingness to be present rather than useful, the non-negotiable authenticity. It requires all of it. Every piece. Because you cannot love without losing yourself if you have not yet found yourself. And finding yourself is the work of a lifetime, but it is findable. Gabor Mate witnessed it. In people who had done the work, in people who had chosen, at real cost, through real fear, against real pressure from a culture that rewards the performance and punishes the reality, to become themselves. And those people, those rare people, had something in common that went beyond any single trait or quality or characteristic. They had a particular quality of aliveness, a presence that you could feel when you were in the room with them. Not charisma, not confidence in the social sense, something quieter and more fundamental than either of those things. The quality of a person who is actually here, actually present, actually living in the life they are in rather than managing it from a careful distance. That quality, that aliveness, is what all 10 traits point toward, what they all together add up to. It is the aliveness of a person who has stopped performing their life and started inhabiting it, who has stopped managing their experience and started meeting it, who has stopped being the character in the story their wounds wrote and started being the author of something that was always, always waiting to be written. I want to say something to those of you who are feeling, as you sit with these 10 traits, a particular kind of ache. The ache that comes not from the traits you recognize in yourself, but from the ones you do not. Not yet. The ones that feel like descriptions of a person you want to be, but cannot quite see how to become from where you are standing right now. That ache is important. Do not explain it away. Do not turn it immediately into a self-improvement project with measurable goals and a timeline. Let it be what it is, the genuine longing of a self that knows it is more than it has been permitted to express. The recognition of a distance between who you have been and who you actually are, and know that Gabor Mate spent 50 years watching people cross that distance. People who started from places far more defended, far more wounded, far more convinced that change was impossible than wherever you are starting from. They crossed it, not by working harder, not by being more disciplined or more committed or more worthy of the crossing. They crossed it by beginning, by taking the first step of genuine seeing, by asking the question that makes everything else possible, by choosing once and then again after that, to move in the direction of who they actually were rather than who they had learned to perform. That choice is available to you right now, in this moment, and every moment after this one. Gabor Mate sat with people who were dying, people who had arrived at the last weeks and months of their lives and were looking back at the whole of it, at the choices made and not made, at the love given and withheld, at the selves expressed and suppressed, at the life lived and the life only performed. And he says that what he witnessed in those rooms, what he heard in those final honest conversations, was remarkably consistent. The regret was almost never about the things people had done. It was almost always about the things they had not allowed themselves to be, the conversations they did not have, the feelings they did not express, the authentic self they kept waiting for the right moment to inhabit, and the right moment never came, because the right moment was every moment, and they were spending every moment managing rather than living. Do not wait for the right moment. The right moment is this one. You have these traits, some of them fully, some of them partially, some of them as seeds that have not yet been given the conditions to grow, and the conditions are not external. They are not a better circumstance or a more supportive relationship or a particular therapeutic modality or the perfect video with the perfect words at the perfect time. The conditions are a decision. The decision to take your own inner life seriously, to treat your own experience as real and worth attending to move however slowly, however imperfectly in the direction of your own becoming. Gabor Mate made that decision himself. He talks about it with remarkable honesty, about the ways his own early wounds shaped his character, his compulsions, his relationships, his parenting, his work, about how long it took him to see what he was looking at, about how the very gifts that made him an extraordinary physician, the sensitivity, the empathy, the attunement to suffering, were rooted in adaptations he had made,